It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin McBride. Kevin McBride is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Connecticut, and he's also director of research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. Kevin specializes in the colonial and Native American archaeology and history. He has been the principal investigator for archaeological research at over 150 archaeological sites, spanning the time frame from the Paleo-Indian period through to the late 19th century. Kevin is especially well known for his Battlefields at the Pequot War project. This project involves identifying and preserving battlefields and historical sites associated with the Pequot War. Its primary goal is the identification of battlefield sites using non-invasive archaeological investigations. It's funded by the National Park Service, American Battlefield Protection Program, and is conducted in collaboration with the Office of the Connecticut State Archaeologist, the Connecticut State Historian, and many local societies and research centers and museums across Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York. Kevin's talk this evening, uncovering the 1675 Battle of Nipmuc, is about a later battle, part of King Philip's War that took place some 40 years later. According to Jill Lepore, King Philip's War was a defining experience for both British colonists and Native American peoples in New England, and it would become a template for the centuries-long contest between Europeans and Indians over control of the continent and the evolving nature of American identity. The Nipmuc territory, centered on Nipmuc Hill and Swamp in Smithfield, Rhode Island, was the location of two important battles in King Philip's War. The first battle occurred shortly after the beginning of the war in 1675, as colonial and Mohegan Indian forces pursued and fought Philip and Weetamoo and their warriors at Nipmuc. Captain Henchman, perhaps uncertain of battle tactics appropriate for swampy landscapes, let the warriors escape, and the war continued for another year. The second battle, and the topic of Kevin's presentation tonight, occurred just days before the war ended. By this time, colonial officers had adapted their battle tactics to swamp warfare, and Connecticut and Mohegan Indian soldiers attacked Queapin's encampment at the edge of Nipmuc Swamp. This battle, according to several modern historians, all but ended the Narragansett resistance. According to Kevin, the attack appears to be part of a larger effort by Connecticut to claim disputed areas of Rhode Island by right of conquest. So please join me in welcoming Kevin.
I just want to mention I'd like to dedicate this lecture to my dear friend Rick Greenwood, the Deputy Historic Preservation Officer at the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission, who passed away a couple of nights ago. He was instrumental in getting this project going, sort of seeing it through, helping us all the time, as was the state archaeologist Tim Ives. I also want to acknowledge my colleague Ashley Bissonette, who's worked on these battlefield projects for ever, I think 7 or 8 years. And Connor, who's a student at Brown, actually worked at Nipmuc several years ago and helping do the battlefield survey, and is since acquiring some skills here in chemistry and anthropology we hope to use pretty soon. But there's a few things about this battle that really became quite interesting and important, and once we began to really understand what's going on here. And seemingly a small, innocuous event during the King Philip's War, we were asked to document it for a very interesting reason. Initially, because the Narragansetts were interested in documenting the battlefield in the context of potential ceremonial events and monuments in the area that may have been related to this battle. More than 130 people died here. And I was very intrigued by this whole concept of, native memorialization of a battlefield. How might that take place? And that's another part of the research I'm not going to talk about today, but so just looking at the historical, cultural, military context of this, it was a really unique battle in a number of different ways. And I just want to echo what Bob said. Between the first and second battles at Nipmuc, which is about a year apart, there were some very significant differences and capabilities of colonial forces in that time. And one aspect of this that most of us weren't aware of or don't acknowledge is Connecticut's role in King Philip's War. I mean, we all know they were there, but most of our knowledge of the history of King Philip's War comes from Hubbard, Mather, Church, you know, sort of the big narrative from Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay. But, you know, Connecticut, even though there isn't a cohesive narrative, played a very significant role in King Philip's War. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is, unlike Plymouth and unlike Massachusetts Bay, at the very beginning of the war, they embraced their native population, partly out of, you know, partly a broader strategy, and that was to keep the peace within the colony, bring the war outside the colony. So there were no major actions fought in Connecticut during the war. And Connecticut dragoons with combined, and this is the key, combined native forces that made up usually 50% of any force that went out, were widely acknowledged to be the most effective during King Philip's War. Never lost a battle, suffered very few casualties, were never ambushed. And this is the force that attacked Queapen's village in July 2nd of 1676. There's a couple of things that are really interesting about this battle. One is the 300 dragoons and 100 Mohegan Pequot who attacked the village was the largest force to enter Narragansett country since the Great Swamp Fight in December 19th. The other thing that was very interesting about it was tactically sophisticated. It was the only horse-mounted attack of King Philip's War. And the commander of the attack will tell you a little about his biography later. But I think what was most interesting to us, and this was actually an idea originally suggested by Doug Harris, Mohegan Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. There may have been a broader context for this attack. This is at the end of the war. Refugee Narragansetts or remnant communities are coming back to Narragansett country, in this case to pursue peace. Yet, you know, this force of 300 dragoons and 100 Mohegan Pequot, who were originally tasked with going to Wabaquasit and Wachusett, left Norwich on June 30th. And the next thing we hear from them is July 3rd. It's a report from Major Talcott, the commander of the force, that they had attacked Nipmuc. So this force with explicit orders to go north to pursue the enemy in the Connecticut Valley via Wachusett, completely either ignored orders or got some new intelligence and went after this village. And I firmly believe it was because of Queapen, who is the last, one of the few surviving sachems. She was a female sachem, and had long been in animosity with Connecticut over a lot of land issues. And she was probably the most powerful, one of the most powerful sachems through the war. No proof, but I have a pretty good sense that she was targeted when they learned that her community was there, and that's sort of quick change of plans. So we'll go through this process. Oops, there we go. Here's what I'll do. I mean, I'm going to give you a brief history of King Philip's War, but, you know, I actually got a really good history from Kevin Smith today, and I think most of you probably know King Philip's War pretty well than I do, so I'm not going to spend much time about it. But I will talk a little about how we do battlefield archaeology, the results of the battlefield, and sort of talk about placing a little broader political context based upon sort of a reanalysis of what's going on. So most of you all know this. Here's Nipmuc, is up here. Again, it was sort of the site of two battles. Just to sort of give you context for the colonies, Mass Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island, as many of you know, pretty much either tried to stay neutral or you know, tried to remain neutral. And here's sort of the major native groups. So with the exception of the Mohegan, Pequot, and Connecticut Indians, almost every other native group in New England was at war with the English. You know that what started out as a local conflict in Plymouth Colony quickly spread to engulf all of New England within 6 months. And proportionally, as I said, the largest conflict, most devastating conflict in American history. Here's some of the names of places. You know, there's Nipmuc, there's Wabaquasit, which is Woodstock, Wachusett, and some other areas. This is sort of orient you during the talk. So these projects have been funded by the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program. Rhode Island has gotten a grant, 2 grants from them. We've gotten about 8 grants from them. I acknowledge them because they're our new best friends. They've been very supportive, and they're one of the most professional of the Park Service organizations I think I've dealt with. They have a lot of expertise, and they're always willing to assist you. And their primary goal is to identify, document, and preserve battlefields important in American history. And we've been fortunate enough to work on the only 17th century battlefields grants yet given. So just a little discussion on how we do battlefield conflict archaeology. And this has evolved over the years. What used to be sort of an antiquarian exercise where you'd go to a battlefield, pick up a few things just to be able to say the battle took place here, sort of, evolved a little bit over time. And it's a growing discipline. There's several universities in England that actually have battle conflict archaeology programs. And these range from, World War II, World War I through, to Roman period times. There's some very interesting studies that have been done. So it's not just about documenting where the conflict took place. It's about attempting to put it in a broader cultural, political context, and that's sometimes a challenge. And it's really about reconstructing the events as well, which require, so that you want a battlefield sequence. You don't want to just do we use metal detectors. You don't want to just do a metal detector survey and you draw a circle around the battlefield and that you walk away. It's bounded space, but you don't really know what happened there. And, while the records and documents may be good for many of the later battlefields in the 18th, 19th century, you can imagine how difficult it is for 17th century battlefields that are and earlier, which is very challenging for Nipmuc. And where this began, sort of the modern approach, was at the Battle of Little Bighorn. A park ranger named Doug Scott in the mid-'80s took advantage of an opportunity that presented itself when the Custer battlefield burned over. And as they were walking the battlefield to assess the damage, they noticed thousands of objects, human remains, horse remains, littered around the battlefield. And there were a number of competing narratives of that battle. There was an Army narrative, and there was a seemingly incoherent Native narrative. The Army narrative is always interesting because there are no survivors of that aspect of the battle, but a lot of the information came from Army groups who returned to that battlefield over the months and years to assemble people, place them in graves, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of question, where these monuments are here. This is, Last Stand Hill. Did that actually take place? How do we reconcile the seemingly inconsistencies in the Native narratives, which were actually accumulated over 60 years. I mean, the veterans of that battle were being interviewed in the 1930s. So what they did was predicated on modern forensic and ballistic analysis. So this is a post-Civil War battlefield. So they basically were able to look at rifled bullets, and they could look at shell casings. So they could, the goal was to track individual weapons across the battlefield. And associate them with individuals, and take those individuals and associate them with larger units. And they came up with some pretty interesting, observations. So the idea here, though, was to add a temporal dimension to that spatial dimension. So you want to be able to sequence that battle through a combination of what's known about the historical record, oral history, and the archaeological record. So that's basically the approach we take on these 17th century battlefields, but you can imagine how difficult it is. We can't track individual weapons across the battlefield. They're musket balls. But the basic concept still works, and we've used it, I think, with quite a bit of success in sequencing the battle events and identify their signatures in the archaeological record. So this is how it works. It's all mostly metal detectors, but not exclusively, because the battlefields that we have documented in the Pequot War and this one all have a domestic native component to it. There's a village or community involved in all these instances too. So there's some traditional archaeology that goes on as well. But the narrative analysis takes place placed first, and that can sometimes be the most challenging of them all. Metal detecting, remote sensing, GIS, everything's integrated into a GIS database. Military terrain analysis, which is actually required analysis by the Park Service when they give you a grant, and it's proven to be pretty useful. This is actually standard training for people at West Point. And we found that once we really began to understand what they were trying to tell us, it was quite useful in understanding the terrain and landscape on the battlefield and the reconstructing events. The narrative research was also really important. This particular battlefield really, and I'll show you the only primary sources we have, there's only a couple, and they were very challenging to get any information from it. But there's all history. This is a gravestone of the Reverend Fitch, who served as minister to a lot of the Connecticut troops. He was Hubbard, if you've ever read a lot of Hubbard's history, if any of it has anything to do with Connecticut's actions or troops, it's coming from Fitch. He was also an interpreter. He went along with most of these expeditions as an interpreter, both to the Mohegan Pequot and presumably any of the native enemy or captives. The other one I want to point out is a little known and critical to our analysis. This is the diary of Thomas Minor. He was a veteran of the Pequot War. He settled in Stonington in the 1650s, and he kept a diary. He was also lieutenant of dragoons from New London County. And without his diary, we would not have known much about the actions that took place by Connecticut and Narragansett country during the war. This is what Ashley does. That's actually real. This is actually Pequot War stuff, where we have a few more narratives, but it's a very complicated task to take various sources of information, try and integrate them into a cohesive theme, looking at inconsistencies, looking at, comparative material, trying to understand, is it, conflicting information, or is it two commanders looking at two different things on the battlefield? It takes a lot of time. And it's an ongoing process before you even get into the field. And then when you're in the field, it's a constant process, too, to try and get a good fit or integrate the historical record into the archaeological record. And what comes out of that is a battlefield timeline, a sequence of events with potential archaeological signatures that we can identify and link to that particular event. So these are the primary sources. This is it. This is all we had to work with. And we thought the Pequot War was challenging and frustrating. This is particularly challenging. So from these few records, one from Major Talcott, who was the overall commander of the attack, and William Hubbard, who probably got his information from Reverend Fitch, we need to locate this battlefield, and we need to develop a battlefield sequence. And, I won't dwell too much on this because we'll look at it again, but we eventually were able to sort of figure things out. This is probably the most challenging battlefield I think we've ever worked on. It took a full year to finally figure it out, and it wasn't until the last month, I think, it began to all come together. But that's the basic battlefield. Here are key features that are mentioned in various places, and this is really the core area of the battlefield right in here that we eventually were able to determine. So the first thing is identify potential locations, and here's the few clues we have. We've got a spruce swamp nearby. We know it was large enough to English to surround it. We know that the Mohegan and Mohegan scouts from the top of a hill could see the Narragansett newly encamped. That was an important clue too, especially with the archaeological signatures. So it would be very light signature because they just got there. What does this within the semicircles of a swamp mean? Is it a convex or a concave? All this was sort of problematic. One thing we did do is we used the techniques, view sheds. What do you see from certain vantage points? And does that help us? Hi, Bill. How you doing? Does that help us, understand where the battle might have taken place? And it helped a lot. And we finally settled on Cat Hill. And these this is part of that COPA analysis. These are key terrain features that we might not have recognized at the beginning of the survey, but we certainly recognized after, especially here, which is this elevated terrain feature that allowed attacking horsemen to quickly get across and help surround. These are a series of islands that one could sort of skip across, not with a horse, but on foot. So the other key area here was Cat Plain, sort of very flat, low ground, which is where most of the attack at speed took place. So all these things were important. And I'm jumping ahead, but you know, this is the Narragansett village. And this is what really gave us a hard time, because we're biased. When we hear the term village, we're thinking of an aggregated community. Not the case here. These are probably different encampments, perhaps family groups. So that was problematic. We weren't finding a centralized place. Plus, the signatures we normally associate with a 7th century village, cut brass and other things, weren't there either. And probably because they were only there a couple of days. They just weren't producing a lot of this material. So, you know, often in these projects, and I'm sure you know this from your experience and research, your biases can often get you into a lot of trouble. You have to often think outside the box. You got to talk to as many other people as you can to sort of try and figure it out. The other problem we had was, you know, metal detecting survey and the methodology. These battlefields are amazingly busy places. There's 350 years of land use after the battle. So that quarrying, logging, chain links, horseshoes, ox shoes, and the one common denominator in human behavior we see on all these battlefields is people like to drink beer and shoot stuff. So thousands and thousands of cans and 22s and others, you know, that are hiding. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Thousands. So that's a problem. And the other problem is this. It's always sort of this negative evidence. You want to know if you've done a sufficiently intensive or sufficient survey that if you don't find something, it's not there, right? And that's a real problem with metal detectors because there's so much variability in operator, the technology, soils. We had a really hard time in these soils because they were highly mineralized. So there's a number of checks and balances we do, and when we are comfortable that when we cover an area, it's covered, then we can walk away saying, it's negative evidence because it's not there versus something else. Very important consideration. So these are some of the archaeological signatures we would be looking for. We're figuring 300 dragoons at speed. Maybe not a full gallop, but pretty quick. They're going to be throwing shoes. They're going to be throwing horseshoe nails. Should be some patterns of that stuff. The native signature should be cut up brass kettles. Well, we were dead wrong about that. There was a few, but not that many. Musket balls, which would be characterize any battlefield. And musket balls are often the most important object on that battlefield because depending upon the diameter, which equates to caliber if it's large. But when the soldiers begin to choose to load their weapons with a lot of small shot for close quarter fighting or a massed enemy or women and children as we found, when do they use larger weapons for distance? All that can really tell you a lot about sort of the tactical adjustments they're making during the battle. It can tell you if it's a rocky place, which parts of Nipmuc were, and these things impact against the rock, we can tell direction of fire as well. So all those clues come into play when we're trying to figure this all out. The biggest challenge in any of these battlefields is, what is it? So yeah, we know pop tabs, we know 22 bullets. Believe me, we are an expert in bullets at this point. So I would estimate out of 5,000 lead bullets, maybe 100 were actually real. And it's tricky because sometimes when they're badly impacted, you really got to be able to tell. And from what it takes a lot of time. And most of the ferrous stuff, the iron stuff, and this is what Connor had been working on, you can't tell what it is. This comes out of these places as a amorphous rusted mass. So we were fortunate enough at the Pequot Museum to have an X-ray machine. So all this stuff goes through. And the first thing you look at is it hand wrought or not? If it's not, it usually gets tossed, unless it's a kettle fragment. And if it is hand wrought, what is it 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th? You know, obviously not going to get hand wrought stuff at 20th and 19th, but you will in the early 19th century. So it's a real challenge. Part of the battlefield training for us all is we really literally have to become experts in 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century material culture. Sort of sort this stuff out and identify what's battlefield. I think when all is said and done, we had about 150 battle-related objects that we could be pretty confident about. Gun parts are important too, because this is telling us things about choices the soldiers are making about weapons, how they're being used, what kinds of weapons. These are from these are Pequot War slides, but they were using matchlocks, though. Matchlocks, even though they were cumbersome, heavy, they could fire long distance, and they, you know, had quite a punch to them. So they're still using these weapons situationally, we're finding. And what we do with all those clues is we sort of come up with, you know, what types of firearms we have on the battlefield, what kinds of ignition systems. In the case of Nipmuc, we were most interested in is, all right, these are dragoons. We know what they're supposed to be carrying, but were they actually carrying? And because of the nature of the diameters, a lot of musket balls, we can infer pistols and carbines, but there was a couple of pretty large weapons as well. And they all carried edged weapons as well, swords. And the other thing we do is we look at the distribution of musket balls, and I'll get into that a little bit later too. So we sort of have this distribution of diameter of musket balls across the whole battlefield. Then we look, so we have sort of the baseline. Then we look at certain areas of the battlefield, what the signature looks like. We can often infer certain types of decisions being made by the soldiers. So here's some of the stuff we did recover. We did recover some Narragansett domestic objects. A bell, jaw harp, cut brass. We were looking for an ornament here, you know, pot hook. Some of these, though, you have to be careful with, like the jaw harp. Everybody's carrying a jaw harp. You know, soldiers, native people are all have them. So you have to be a little careful about, you know, that. But since it was found in one of the domestic areas, we can make that inference. You know, we're finding a wide range of knives and other kinds of implements, some folding knives. We're getting some gun flints that were found in a domestic context. And these are interesting, and I'll show you a picture, another image. My previous experience with King Philip's War was through the lens of the Pequot. We had been studying excavating a Mashantucket Pequot fortified village called Monhantic, date 1675, 1677. And we had a great baseline of, you know, technology and material culture, things of that nature. It was a village, but it was also clearly geared for military production. We had over 1,500 pieces of English ballast flint, you know, several dozen gun flints. The gun flints were interesting because they were none of them were made in the way that Europeans make their gun flints, either blade gun flint or swall. They're all bifaces. And, you know, bifacial technology, very ancient technology, dates back, you know, thousands of years. So, you know, we can't always tell if we find a random gun flint on the battlefield, is it Narragansett or is it Pequot? But we can reasonably infer that it's probably native. We found some other complex objects that were composite objects made from cut-up kettles and re-riveted, and have some organic material in the middle of them. So, and these were, we don't know what they were, but these two were found in some of these domestic areas. So there were other things too, fragments of glass, maybe fragments of earthenware, things of that nature that sort of characterize these encampments. But as I said before, the key, which we didn't really map on, is, you know, that reference to recently arrived or newly enswamped. The Narragansett probably only got there a couple of days before. And, you know, and it makes perfect sense in the context of, you know, Calcutt redirecting 400 men to Nipmuc. It must have, against his orders, must have been a last minute thing. So that just presented, it resulted in a very low signature for us. And eventually the persistence and finally figuring out that it is a low signature and we shouldn't be looking at an aggregated village. I think we finally figured it out. Here's some of the English objects. Those horseshoes we did get. We got a lot of nails. In fact, when you plot the horseshoe nails, they actually, you can readily plot the movement sometimes of the English and their movements. Most of the horseshoes, though, were found the way the battle progressed, and I'll talk about it. They literally ran right up to the swamp, where most of the Narragansetts who weren't killed or captured after the first attack were managing to escape into one of the swamps. So these were found right up along the edge. So it really looks like these guys were going at speed right to the edge of the swamp in an attempt to sort of, capture or take. We found several buttons. Now the buttons are problematic. They too could be, native or English. We tended to find them in context that suggested more English based upon the battlefield situation. Aglets, we found a horse bolster, things of that nature. But generally, we really expected a lot more material on this battlefield than we did get. And, we're constantly reassessing why that was. Are we not finding it? Are we not, is it the metal detecting technology? Is it our survey techniques? And I think what we finally concluded is it kind of makes sense in the context of low signature for the native encampments. But this battle happened really fast until it got to the swamp. And then it was a 3-hour battle. But between the initial attack and the edge of the swamp, we're probably talking minutes, no more than that. And there probably wouldn't have been a lot of opportunity to drop, find a lot of broken stuff. The Pequot War battlefields we're finding, and one of the ones we're documenting now is the English withdrawal after the Musket attack over 6 miles. We're finding evidence of intense fighting the entire way. We've got literally hundreds and hundreds of broken and discarded objects. But these guys are moving on foot. It's heavy fighting over long distance. Whole different signature to that battlefield. And here's an interesting, I'm going to dwell on this because I think it's cool, but this is sort of a lead musket ball that was fashioned into a gunflint wrap. So you know how a gunflint is placed in the cock of a flintlock and screwed down to hold it. Well, it won't just sit there. It has to be seated. And by that, they either use deerskin, but the best is leather. Best is lead because it's malleable and it'll form itself around that gunflint. It'll be a nice. So this is actually convex. And here's a gunflint from Monhantic Fort, bifacial. It fits there really neatly. But the interesting part, too, we could actually see the flintlock jaw marks on these things, too. So where that was found on the battlefield could have been a native Narragansett defender or a Pequot or Mohegan attacker. We'll never know that. But that is definitely a native signature that we were able to pick up. So this is all the 17th century objects except for musket balls. So you can see there are several concentrations. One here, one here, one here, and one here. Those are all where the Narragansett encampments were. So they're very light signatures, but they're definitely domestic signatures. These are combinations of English and native as they're sort of pursuing or fleeing, pursuing the Narragansett into the swamp or fleeing into the swamp. So I mentioned the musket balls are very critical to our analysis. So this image on the right looks at dropped and impacted. So impacted are red, dropped are green. It could be a little larger there, but when you see green, dropped, people are reloading. And if there's a lot of dropped ones, they're reloading a lot. And they're probably pretty nervous, they're on horseback, et cetera, et cetera. So the initial attacks here is where, from the north wing is where you see a lot of this. Pretty intensive fighting here. And we also see evidence of a lot of defense here. And we infer that from the direction of fire coming from the base of this hill outward to the attacking English. So there were 35 Narragansett men of that 170 to 200 contingent. They probably all died. But we did infer some interesting things. One, and throughout King Philip's War, you can see this in any of the records, there was tenacious defense if there was any women and children involved. But you also see a big gap between here and where it picks up again. This is this plain, we call the plain where the horses could really get moving. Before that, horse-mounted attack is pretty tough in these areas because it's kind of rocky. We wondered about what this represented. What we think it represents is this. The initial attack, pretty tenacious defense, bought time for a lot of the women and children to make it this far before the English caught up with them again and sort of the battle started. And many of them, it also bought time for them to escape into the swamp, eventually making their way perhaps to this island. So those do tell you quite a bit. The other thing that this tells you, this is diameter. So the green is the smallest diameter. That's like 24 to 0.24 to 0.40 diameter. That's small shot. That's what you load your weapon with, 6 or 8 of those if you have an enemy who's near or massed or coming at you, or in this case, women and children. There was an inordinate number of women and children killed in this battle. It just didn't make sense to us. In fact, if you look at the number of women and children in previous battles in King Philip's War, with very few exceptions, you don't see the casualty rate here. I mean, we estimate over 100 women and children were killed in this battle. And there's some sense that they may have been being targeted. And where you get that perspective is there's several areas on the battlefield where we would find concentrations of impacted small shot in an area no bigger than this. So what that suggests is perhaps someone on the ground and someone shooting at them. You just don't get that concentration. Yeah, it could be a misfire. But it happened 3 times, so we think some of these people were being targeted. Queequeg, if you've been one of those people. Here's some of the musket balls. Here's some of the larger stuff impacted and dropped. These, I just mentioned that sort of a couple of areas where we found 6 to 8 of these shots. This is one. This was a single blast in an area about this big. And there were 3 such occurrences of those. This is interesting. I mean, one thing we always do with these musket balls is look for any clues to the kind of weapon or caliber. This is a firing ring, and that only happens when the diameter of the musket ball is very close to the diameter or caliber of the gun. So you can sort of tell it's a .50 caliber, which means it's probably coming from a pistol. If it's a little higher, 50s, low 60s, it might be a carbine, something like that. So those are important clues too. When you put these all together, you begin to get a sense of how the battle actually progressed. We also look, as I was mentioning before, the distribution of musket balls by diameter. Here's all of them. That gives you a good baseline. This is like full muskets. This is like really high stuff. That's 60 and above. You get a couple of 70s there. When you get in the 70s, you're probably looking at matchlocks. This is all small shot. This from here over. This is probably in the pistol carbine range, and then you're getting into sort of full muskets. It's a pretty high percentage of lower. So certainly in this range could be, pistol. This range is basically multiple loads of shot. And what we do is you compare that to some other battlefields. One was the English Civil War. So that's this purple. You can immediately see in terms of the distribution of shot, it's all in the large range. These guys are shooting each other from 100 yards away. If you look at the other battlefields we have a couple from the Pequot War. 1519 is the Pequot massacre site, Mystic. Relatively high percentage of low diameter shot, because we know that one of the first actions of the English when they snuck up to the fort was to put their muskets through the palisade walls and shoot at everybody sleeping in their wigwams. And we actually see those clusters of small shot on the battlefield. 5940 is what we call the retreat. And this is where there are a couple of occasions where based on the narratives, we know that dozens, if not 100 Pequot men rushed the English, and they turned and fired. And we also know they were firing small shot into thickets and swamps to clear the way. But for the most part, the battlefield was characterized by large caliber outside of those special situations, because the Pequots were at a distance. These are all men now. There weren't women and children. So you can see that on the battlefield. Nipmuc falls squarely into the Pequot village massacre. And they're definitely using an inordinate amount of small shot, and we think because, partly because of the initial surprise attack, they're going to be targeting people who are masked. And we think with the speed of horsemen, you could quickly come upon somebody and dispatch them. So here's the encampments with all the stuff. And what I'm going to do now is walk through quickly sort of a laborious exercise on this battlefield timeline, just to give you a sense of how this is done and what happened as the battlefield progressed. One thing we never figured out is where the English encampment was. So we know that they arrived. So here's how this early part of this battle took place. So whatever intelligence Talcott got to redirect all these forces to Cat Hill, we don't know where he's coming from, the south, the west, the north. We do know there he arrived the day before, perhaps in the afternoon. We do know he captured 3 native men who likely gave them some information about the location of this village. While they were probably making their encampment a distance enough away so they couldn't be heard, but close enough that they could get 300 horses there quickly at dawn the next morning. We also know they sent out their Mohegan and Pequot scouts who talk about, from the top of Cat Hill, they could see, the encampments. Not much detail, but based on the sophistication of the battle, 2 wings of dragoons basically go around this hill, split into 2, go around this hill. The Mohegan Pequots come down the hill, and all this is happening at once. Upon command, all these various components of this force move, and they quickly encircle. And to do that requires an enormous amount of experience and training. And while we don't know their approach, these smaller arrows tell us where they came from during the attack. So somewhere they got here and then split up and went around. But the other thing I want to mention, so this is an amazingly coordinated attack. I don't think you see anything like this in King Philip's War. But the Mohegan, Pequot, and English had been fighting together for 8 months. They had been fighting alongside each other. They were fully integrated as a unit. They were experienced. They trusted one another. And I think this battle, this sophistication, I haven't talked about George Dennison, who probably orchestrated the plan. It's all based on a lot of intelligence being gathered. Not only where the Narragansett encampments were, but footing for horses, slope, terrain, all of that came into play. Whatever information came back to Talcott and Dennison by those Pequot, they knew the best ground for horses, too. So all this was sort of put together to develop this battle plan, which is carried out the next morning. So it's a little more sophisticated than just, running around a hill, hoping for the best. So here's the timeline. I know it's a little laborious, but basically this is what we do. This basically outlines what I just discussed. They split into 2 groups, a north wing and a south wing, Pequot, Mohegans in the middle. At command, they basically quickly engulf this. So the initial attack clearly engulfed, captured a number of Narragansett. They were totally surprised. Most of them were women and children. We also saw some indication that after that initial attack, time was bought by some of the Narragansett men to let the women and children escape to the swamp. So when the English get to the swamp, they begin this process of encircling it, engulfing it, and dismounting, and entering the swamp. And I'll show you this sequence. So basically, it's this circle here. That part of the battle took 3 hours. And we don't know how many people died in the swamp. We don't know how many people died outside. We just know there's an enormously low number of captives compared to what we usually see in these actions. Connecticut really seemed bent on destruction, not capture in this context. So here's how we sort of reconstruct this. So here are the Narragansett encampments, one there, one there, one there, one there. And this reconstruction is based upon dropped English equipment, horseshoe nails, horseshoes, dropped equipment, musket balls, direction of fire, all that kind of thing. So we have 3 wings: Southern English, Northern English wing, and Mohegan. So they begin the battle, and we know this is where they're coming from because we can infer direction of fire from some of the musket balls, both coming in and going out from the defenders. And as they proceed to, they split a couple of places to engulf and capture the other communities. Mohegan Pequots are going down. This plain is very flat, very amenable to the horses at speed. But I mentioned that there's some time perhaps being bought, but we're only talking minutes. We sort of estimated the amount of time a horse would take to get, from here to there at a full gallop, and it's just a couple of minutes, just, very short time. But it was enough, at least to get some of these people escape safely to the swamp. And they continue their encirclement. Now, we also see some of the battle taking a kind of an interesting turn uphill. I'm sure you can imagine what happens in a situation like this. Some people are fleeing to the safety of the swamp. Some people are just fleeing. So they're pursuing people in different ways too, and we infer that from dropped things and impacted musket balls and horseshoe nails, things of that nature. And eventually they would have had to have gotten off the horse, and they would have done the rest of this by foot. Here, though, because of this elevated terrain feature, the horse continued. One of the documents mentioned one of the captains and his men getting off their horses and going into the swamp. We see all of the vast majority of the horseshoes we did find were on the swamp edge. And so when they getting into the muck of the swamp edge, it's just sucking these horseshoes right off, and they're getting off the horses and pursuing the Narragansett into the swamp. And they continue the encirclement. We don't know, but we infer that the last defense took place on this island. We don't find anything here. We don't really find anything further. These are a couple of large musket balls that are impacted, so that suggests there's probably still some people fleeing out there. And I'm sure there's a Narragansett that escaped this too. But most of their effort was here, sort of, surround the swamp and then begin to close in on it. One thing we didn't do for a number of reasons was do much metal detecting inside the swamp for some obvious reasons. One, there might have been more than 100 people here who died. We really weren't, finding those people would not materially contribute anything to the battle. We sort of already knew what happened. Then there's some practical reasons too. It's really tough to use metal detectors in the water. Some of the swamp mud was pretty thick and deep. And we actually, which my crew never lets me forget, we didn't actually do this survey till late November, December. So that was an interesting thing, working in the swamp, because honestly, we didn't figure this out until like the last 11th hour. It was it's a 67-acre battlefield. This stuff is widely dispersed. It just took a long time and a lot of back and forth and talking amongst ourselves to finally get this to the point where we could figure something out. So I mentioned this as being one of the most sophisticated attacks of King Philip's War, the only horse-mounted attack. So George Dennison, we know, was second in command. And Talcott, first in command, he really wasn't a military guy. He's one of those political appointees. George Dennison, though, fought in the Pequot War as a young boy of 19. He went and fought in the English Civil War, and he became Cromwell's captain of cavalry. And Cromwell, some of you may know, revolutionized cavalry tactics, training, weapons, formation, drill, et cetera, et cetera. So George Dennison is coming back after his experiences in the English Civil War. He's a really competent cavalry commander. So the men, the dragoons under him, may well have received a good deal of that training as well. And to operate in a combined force, Mohegan, Pequot, English, dragoons, usually what dragoons do is they just ride to within a mile or two of where they're going to fight, get off the horses, and walk. This is not the case this time. So whatever the intelligence was they got back from their Mohegan, Pequot scouts, they figured they could make this attack and conduct it quickly. So his signature, I think, is all over that battle. We actually are doing, his homestead is in Stonington, Connecticut, and we're still, a lot of the local militias dragoons used to meet there before they went on various expeditions. So we're doing a fair amount of work there trying to document that phase of King Philip's War. The other thing is interesting is this, and didn't really realize this till kind of late in the process. We were always sort of struck by the ferocity of the attack, the few survivors, the fact that they would divert 400 men to a major effort in the Connecticut Valley against a village of 170 people. And once we began to, and this is always the case, you don't really understand the entire picture until you go back and review all the narratives and documents and things like this. In Rhode Island, colonial records and Connecticut colonial records and Hubbard were very important in this respect. So what we think is going on is this. We think this attack had a lot to do with Connecticut's overall effort to maintain claim to Narragansett country that they had been fighting with over Rhode Island since 1662 and 3. So here's Connecticut's charter, which, by the way, was largely awarded because they had a great claim for right of conquest over the Pequot. So maybe they're trying this again. You can see that the boundaries are completely the same. Completely the same. Right? And this is from the king's, letter of the king. So Connecticut, who felt they were there early, are claiming all of this. So if you look at the Rhode Island colonial records from 1664 to 1672 or 3, most of the business of the Rhode Island legislature is about this. And it's always the same kind of thing. Connecticut's just being, Connecticut. They're being, I am from Connecticut, so I'm close to the door, though, right? So they basically say, nope, we claim this by charter. They are imposing their laws, putting their magistrates in place in various places in Rhode Island. There's also a very strong contingent of Rhode Islanders who are with Connecticut. It's part of the Atherton Purchase and Pettisquamscot Purchase, people in Narragansett. So it was always, Rhode Island would complain. It was more like, okay, you guys, you're going into their houses, you're taking them out, you're arresting them, you're beating them up, you're doing this. Back off. And Connecticut would say we have every right to. And Rhode Island would come back with a more conciliatory tone. It's like always the same. I don't know over 8 years why this couldn't have gotten resolved, but it was, we'll meet, they don't meet, we'll meet, letters back and forth. It's probably several dozen letters in Rhode Island historical records about this. It's interrupted during King Philip's War for obvious reasons. You don't hear anything about this dispute until 2 weeks after the war ends on August 22nd. And here's what you get. Connecticut publishes a letter, Providence, Westerly, Hartford, somewhere else, basically claiming Narragansett country by right of conquest and vacuum domicilium. I mean, when was the last time you heard that term, right? So this is empty lands. So not only is it empty of Narragansett, it's empty of Rhode Island colonists. Right. So here's Rhode Island's responses. Are you kidding me? None of that's true. We didn't do any of it. Right. So the other piece to this, though, if you look to the Colonial War records of Connecticut, you will not see a single reference, really very little reference to Narragansett country during the war, with the exception of a major expedition or if there's Narragansetts moving around. What you don't see reflected is the activity of the local dragoons from London County under this guy named Thomas Minor. He also served in the Pequot War. By the way, both he and Denison are in their 60s, leading troops in battle, so there's hope for some of us here anyways. So here's just excerpts from his diary. These guys, so after Narragansett is brought into the war, December 19th, 1675, that's it. There's not a single major effort in Rhode Island by Plymouth, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay that's reflected in the records. Where it is reflected is in his diary. These guys are in the field in Narragansett country every other week for a week. The only limiting factor is the food they can carry for their horses and themselves. But they are there every other week from March through July, pounding Narragansett country. All you see reflected in the colonial records is the number of bushels captured or the number of captives or things of this nature. The other thing about Minor, he surveyed the Pettaquamsett Purchase. This guy knew the Narragansett country cold. So they had great experience, great intelligence, and these troops of dragoons would, there's usually 60 to 80 with 20 to 40 Mohegan or Pequot. Because remember, the main effort of Connecticut was always in the Connecticut River Valley or in central Massachusetts. But Connecticut is sending these men continuing to Narragansett country, and we originally thought it was sort of a good an offensive defense. But when we began to look into the records a little more carefully, we began to realize this had a broader strategy to it. And there's not a single mention of this in any of the colonial records, and perhaps rightfully so. You can just see the end result. And the other part of this, we think, too, is, Quiapan, arguably one of the most powerful Narragansett sachems before the war and during the war, who very often ran afoul of Connecticut because she just wasn't taking any BS from anybody. Any of the negotiations, she was, usually the toughest. What's really interesting is this. So most of the Narragansett sachems are up in the upper Connecticut River Valley for a good part of the winter. They're beginning to come down March, April, May, partly because they're starving, but partly because they're beginning to pursue peace negotiations with the English. So when Quiapan's community was attacked, one of her guys, her ambassadors, was on his way to Massachusetts Bay to negotiate peace. The other of her ambassadors was a guy named, I'm going to butcher this, Wetaquasin. He actually had in his possession a letter of free passage to the English lines. He had been the one negotiating between the Connecticut and the Narragansett throughout the winter. And these fits and starts of peace negotiations. When you read this in context, it really looks like Connecticut is just, kind of pretty happy about that situation. That this guy with a free passage and he's supposedly, making these peace overtures is killed. So we'll never know this, but our strong suspicion is that Quiapan and her counselors were executed. No evidence to support that whatsoever, but given the overall objectives, I think. So in conclusion, I think what we are now attempting to do with these battlefield projects is just this. Put these events and actions, the military aspects of it in a broader cultural political context, and it's actually proven very valuable for the stuff we're doing in the Pequot War as well. But I think this is a singularly interesting and important aspect of King Philip's War that I think is largely going unknown. So I'll stop there. I'll reserve some time for any questions that you might have. Yes?
Could you derive any evidence that the horseback riders were following any of Cromwell's strategy?
I think probably not, only because lack of open field. From what I can gather when I read, these guys are mostly narrow trails. This because of this, if you saw the battlefield, and presumably it was clear, you would see this plain. It was only like 3-4 acres. But it was an opportunity to get these horsemen into some kind of, massed formation, whereas for the most part, they're traveling on trails. They really can't get moving. So I think this is the only context we see that. Yes?
In John Barry's biography of Roger Williams, points out that Roger Williams went to meet King Charles II in England to get the charter, and that one of the motivations of King Charles to allow this kind of charter to Roger Williams was the fact that Massachusetts was a Puritan group whose former governor had been one of the parties that had killed Charles I's father, and now you've brought in a picture that there's also now Cromwell's people in Connecticut, which would balance it off, that he would want to, Charles II would want to give space to somebody who was in opposition to two of his enemies.
So that's very interesting context, but it also speaks to something very important from my perspective. I'm an archaeologist. I am not well versed in colonial history in that respect, and that's a problem. So a lot of these contexts are very difficult for us to explore, to realize, without talking to as many different people as we can. So that's great.
John Barry's book is an excellent one on English history, Massachusetts history, and
so we'll definitely,
a little bit of Connecticut.
Definitely check that one out. Thanks a lot. I also want to mention, by the way, that there's a wonderful new book out by a colleague of ours, Major Jason Warren, who just published a book called Connecticut Unscathed. It's a sort of a history of Connecticut's role in King Philip's War. It's really well researched. It's really well done. Just came out last month. Yeah.
What were the extent of the casualties among the English and their Indian allies?
For Connecticut, very few. In fact, in this particular engagement, no one was killed, 2 Mohegan Pequot wounded. And if you look at this throughout, we've looked at this a lot. I mean, if you look at the history of King Philip's War in Hubbard or Mathard, I mean, Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth troops are just getting hammered out there. They're just not doing well on the battlefield. Partly because they never embraced native allies until the end of the war. Church is a great example. He did earlier. But even when they did it was only a couple. They used them as scouts. Connecticut troops were these units were fully integrated, and they fought together. The Pequot were involved in 26 expeditions in the 11 months of the war. They were constantly in the field, and they were always in the field. In fact, the Connecticut troops refused to go out on expeditions if they didn't have Mohegan and Pequot to accompany them. That's just a testament to their value. But it was also, they weren't just being used as guides and spies. This is a good example. They were fully integrated into the battle plan. Yeah, Pat.
Yeah, there's some stuff about this war. It's really gratifying to see somebody go out there.
Well, you started all right. Yep.
In many cases, it supports things that we were speculating on. I mean, I had argued that the English would use increasing amounts of small shot as the war went on, and this tends to support that, which is nice to see. I'm really struck by the fact that you found these 9 balls, which you consider the charge. I don't know if you're aware of it, a double-aught buckshot round. This is the standard deer round today, and the standard military round is exactly 9 balls.
Is that right? Well, we found a few of those too, which really freaked it. We had like 6 of these for a while, and then I always look at the musket balls under a microscope. I started noticing a couple of them had copper jackets. Oh, Jesus, right? So here we go. Yeah, so, we had to go through these. We probably went through the musket ball assemblage here, I would say 12 times to make sure that...
At least you're not the little big one, which they used as a shooting range.
Well, this was used as a shooting range by 2 neighbors. And when I say 5,000, I'm not even exaggerating. Connor remembers a couple of days, and he spent days and days just pulling out 22s, just in hopes that we had something underneath it. I think you got 1 for all that effort, but yeah, these are problems often. Yeah.
Did you have a picture of the battlefield today?
I don't, or I didn't include it. Actually, I was looking for one.
Housing is going up and all.
No, actually, it's all owned by private property, but it's in inaccessible. So these lots would be linear and they go back. The battlefield is perfectly preserved. The only thing that might happen is, and Tim can speak more to this, is, relic collectors, but there seems to be no long-term, plans to develop. It's relatively intact. It's kind of inaccessible. So, I think everybody feels pretty comfortable. I think the issue that everybody's having now is how can we make this visible to the public in a way that won't impact the landowners or the battlefield. Yeah?
Isn't there a court case, or am I confusing it with another battlefield? Wasn't it just recently a court case?
In North Smithfield?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They wanted to build, and then the courts told them they are.
Yeah, it was about these ceremonial stone piles, which I guess in a way led to this project. It's about a mile away. Yes, back.
Skeletal remains or mass grave for those that were killed, or?
We don't know. The one thing I do get a sense of from all the reading I've done in King Philip's War is natives never left anyone on the battlefield. In fact, I think I can think of maybe one or two times the English would comment, "Oh my God, they actually left some people on the battlefield." So it never happened. So my guess is, and we had the same discussion about the Mystic Massacre too, where 400 Pequots were killed. I'm sure they were collected. I'm sure they were given a proper burial. One of the questions we have, though, is could they have, that swamp is, 15 acres. Did they recover? Could they have recovered everybody that, died in the swamp? So, and that was one of the reasons why we were asked to get involved, too, in this monumentation. Were some of the stone features on this landscape part of the memorialization of the people who died here, or were some of them burials? So that's still an ongoing question, I think. But I would be very confident that if people could be, buried, they were buried. Yes, back.
With battlefield archaeology dealing with hundreds of years, how much does climatology come into what you need to examine and understand? As you, for example, the size of the swamp. Is it hundreds of years? It's not enough to worry about the size of the swamp growing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this played a huge factor here. Because and you're right, the ebb and flow of the swamp, what was it like on that particular day, time? Was it dry? Was it wet? Was it usually hot? Because that has a lot to do with, movements across the battlefield. The other question we had is the English sources are pretty specific about a spruce swamp. Not cedar. Then the debate is that, well, okay, did they know the difference between cedar and spruce, pine? And that what we finally figured out is, yeah, they do. That's not a big surprise. But that elevated terrain feature, that, if you remember that in one of the maps, actually cut the swamp and provided different drainage north side to south side. So the north side of that was cedar and the south side was spruce. So that really helped us focus in on that southern part of the swamp. So it's partly looking at sort of climate and rainfall and weather and sort of understand battlefield terrain. This is important here because of the horse attack. But it's also as the composition of these things change. So we did a lot of deed research to see the references to the spruce swamp versus the cedar swamp. So, but then, the change, are they from deforestation and regrowth? Are they from this or from that? But those are all important factors. What did the landscape look like? We have this huge question right now about the Pequot retreat, the English retreat from the Pequot Mystic Massacre. Is what did that landscape look like? That would be, obviously culturally modified, but we think from thousands of years of native, forest management. But those are all questions that enter every single discussion on the battlefield. All right. Anyone else? Yeah.
So is it surprising that the Narragansett had no scouts to detect the arrival of the 300?
Well, those 3 that they captured may have been the scouts. We don't know that. And yes, it would be surprising. I mean, these people know they're being pursued. And they obviously sent these scouts west, north, because that's, where presumably, the English may have been coming from. But the English relied enormous amount on the intelligence gathered by their native people, who were obviously just as good. Jason Warren has argued that the Mohegan Pequot may have been much better suited to this type of warfare because their experiences and their knowledge. I don't know if that's true or not, but they would have sent out scouts. But nonetheless, they were surprised. I'm not sure how they could be surprised by 300 men on horseback approaching. But the English were, they did it. It's an interesting thing. Back?
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about analyzing the narrative? You had that slide like a circuit board.
Yeah, I hear you. Wasn't that one, right?
What's going on? I could do that.
Was it?
When you have sometimes conflicting descriptions of an event and accounts of it.
That one?
No, back. It was the they were got columns and paragraphs on them. They were
Which one?
from side to side.
My really complicated charts.
Oh, way back. I love that chart.
Yeah.
And that's actually
The early ones you showed.
yeah, I got it. That one, yeah, it's pretty funny. And that's a dummied down version. So this is the Pequot War. We have maybe a 6 to 12 narratives that are pieces. So, and Ashley can speak to you far better this than I can. But it's a matter of, any of you are historians, you understand what one has to do with a document or narrative. You have to contextualize it. Who's informing who, for one thing? Who's borrowing from who? Which is a first-person account? Which is who's there in the battlefield? Is there an account by someone who's not on the battlefield, but he's interviewing a soldier when he first gets back? In the case of Hubbard, I have no doubt that Reverend Fitch is giving this information, but what does Hubbard do with it when he gets it? Is he just quoting the letter? So, all this is looked at, and we've spent, honestly, years on these narratives trying to, and we still come up with different things. So then the question is, which of those are complementary? Which of those are contradictory? And if they're complementary, great, you just double the amount of information on a particular aspect of the battlefield. And if they're contradictory, it doesn't always mean that someone's wrong or making it up. And what we discovered a couple of times, it's different people with different emphasis or different commanders of different parts of the battlefield. So this not only is an exercise on paper, we go through these discussions every day on the battlefield. Every single day, we would go through this discussion, trying to make this fit, challenging, figuring out. The watchword on the battlefield is we don't want to be right, we want to get it right. So we go through these discussions all the time. Every person on that would have, the narratives, they'd be reading them, we'd have these discussions all the time, like what works, what doesn't. And it's a process, but I think in the cases that in the instances we've been able to apply this, I think we've come up with some reasonable inferences. I'm not saying they're perfectly correct, but I think they're reasonable. But this is a very long and difficult process. Actually, it's months and years, I think, for the most part. Yeah, go.
I just need a reference to Captain Arthur Fenner, who was a Rhode Islander, dealing with Connecticut at the expenses of Talbot's troops.
Oh, really?
Camping at his place, at his garrison house.
Oh, this would have been in along near Wickford, or?
No, this was around Minnesota Land.
Right. And that's where Talcott wrote from. His letter to the War Council was from his house. But I never saw the bill. You don't remember where you saw that, do you? All right, well, we'll find it. That's a great piece of information. Yeah, Pat.
Could you comment on how GIS helped you with this, whether you use like LiDAR, terrain?
Well, it does several things. One, first of all, the LiDAR data, and you saw most of these maps, you can get some really, so you know what a topographic map is. Well, these days, we can get much better more refined topography to 1 to 2 foot, contour intervals. But GIS is also really useful. So how we do our work is we'll put an imaginary grid over the entire battlefield, Cartesian coordinates. Then when the planets are right, and the stars are right, and the satellites are right, and we know we have good coverage, we'll get enough of those points GPS multiple times to know it's an accurate reading. GPS, by the way, is not the panacea we thought it was going to be, obviously. It's 'cause the thing with these battlefields, you need to be much more than plus or minus 2 meter accurate, especially if it's in a tight, battle space. So we strive for 50 centimeter, and the only way to get that is mapping everything to the nearest 50 centimeters on a grid. So those grid lines you saw, I think when we do the methodology, the survey methodology, are actual real grid points that are on the ground, that enough of those points were GPS to within 50 centimeter accuracy that we'd be comfortable with doing that. But then integrating it is wonderful. I mean, the things one can, as you know, the layers, it's really challenging because when we're doing the analysis, we need to look at, okay, let me just look at this class of artifacts versus this, let me combine these two, let me do, and you have to go through all these permutations to sort of get a sense of things too. And GIS just makes that much easier, much, much easier. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.